Hi guys, round 10 of the candidates tournament is over. Nepomniachtchi now 1 point ahead of the field after a crushing victory against Kirill Alexenko. All other games ended in draws, and with 4 rounds to go, now Nepo is the clear favorite to win the event. And most videos are talking about his game. It was very nice, but that means there's no reason for me to talk about this game as well. So I chose another game that we will have a look at, and that is the game MVL against Giri. And MVL opened with 1e4, and Giri played the same weapon he played 2 rounds ago against Nepomniachtchi, and where he got a solid draw, so there was no reason for him to change his choice for today. So c5, knight f3, knight c6. MVL goes for the open Sicilian with d4, c takes d4, d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, e5. This is the Sveshnikov Sicilian, and knight db5 is really the only move here that white can play. Otherwise, black would just get a great Sicilian structure with bishop b4. So knight db5 threatens to get in via d6, so black has to play d6 now, and white played the move knight d5 here. Let's talk about the options white has in this structure. The main factor in the position is the weak square on d5, and so the main line is clearly bishop g5, which is a move Nepomniachtchi played against Giri 2 rounds ago. And in general, the game continues with a6, knight a3, the only square, and now black tries to restrict this knight on a3. If this knight would get to c4, all of a sudden there are options to immediately go for the light squares in the center. So b5 is the main idea of the Sveshnikov, and Nepo chose the most solid setup for white. He went knight d5, bishop e7, and took on f6. And this setup is really the most solid one in the Sveshnikov. White is trying to get a slight advantage, but black has the 2 bishops, and most likely dynamic equality is really the most appropriate evaluation of this line. And MVL played a different move. He played knight d5, and this is not the way textbooks tell you how you play against weak squares like the square on d5, because you don't want to have a pawn on that square. You want to be able to use the square for your pieces. So knight d5 is a really concrete approach, and it was always considered to be pretty innocuous. But Caruana then unleashed it in his World Championship match against Magnus Carlsen in 2018. And afterwards, people found new ideas. And these days, there are a lot of people who try to play this line, even though black has a pretty decent score, mainly because Magnus Carlsen is the defender of the black side, and he really has a great score with it. So let's talk about this knight d5 move. First of all, there's really no alternative to just taking on d5. Knight c7 is a big threat, so knight takes d5 is forced. White recaptures with the e-pawn, and now we have a pretty unbalanced pawn structure. White has his majority on the queen side with these pawns on d5, a2, b2, and c2, and black has his majority on the king side. I'm not sure why the one pawn is blue, this was by accident. Black has one majority on the king side with his pawns on e5, f7, g7, and h7. And that means the game can become extremely sharp. For example, in the World Championship match between Caruana and Carlsen, there were some games where black really had to went all in with f5, and then at some point even g5, just to get counterplay on the king side. On the other hand, white is trying to expand his pawns on the queen side, trying to create a breakthrough there. And here there's really a big difference in what black can play. Knight b8, which is played in the game, is a move that leads to more normal position. Knight e7 is a little bit trickier. First of all, there's a nice opening trap. Maybe some of you fell right into it or have played it from the white side, and that is that after c4 you really shouldn't go a6 here with black, because all of a sudden queen a4 is annoying, pinning the pawn on a6, and black just has big problems preventing the threat of knight c7 and knight d6. So for example, bishop d7, knight takes d6 is just mate. So yeah, don't play a6 in this position, and instead the main line here is knight g6, and you really get some weird setups. The main line goes with queen a4, once again trying to go for some business with knight c7 or knight d6, but black can answer with bishop d7, and often the queen ends up on b4, and people these days found out that it's nice for white to include h4 and h5 in this position, just so it's much harder for black to mobilize his own majority on the king side. So very weird positions, also playable for black, but knight b8 is really the move that is easier to play in my opinion, because now it's really about the typical ideas. If one side had the majority on the one side and the other side had the majority on the other wing. And Maxime played the move c4, which was the old main line, but the line which was always considered to be pretty good for black. So let's talk about this move c4 first, and why it was always considered to be not that great for white. The main problem is that black can go for a blockade on the dark squares, and that means, let's say, both sides try to develop their pieces. Oh, this was the main the game continuation, but let's say both sides just develop their pieces. Bishop e2, black plays a6 at some point, knight c3, knight d7, and on the first glance it might seem as if the white pawn break is much easier to accomplish, just because yeah, black really is far away from creating threats with these pawns. But white really has to be careful. So for example, if he starts with b4, which is a mistake, then black can already answer with a5, and white is not able to keep control over the dark squares on the queen side. Positionally speaking, white would love to play a3 in this position so that he's able to recapture with the pawn, but here the a3 pawn is pinned because the rook on a1 is not protected. So this would be a great way for black to achieve a favorable structure on the queen side. And even if white is a little bit more careful and plays a position like castles, let's say king h1, f5, and then he at some point goes b4 only in a position where a5 is not as horrible, because at the very least you can exchange and then go a3. Just to explain the structure, even in a position like this, black can still go for b6, and this is like the other way for black to create a nice blockade on the dark square. I mean, white might be able to prepare c4, c5 somehow, but it's really hard for him to get in this advance under good circumstances, just because the pawn structure on the queen side is really holding his position together, and black is just considered to be fine in a position like this. And the new idea in this knight d5 line is indeed to just let's go to the right position. The new main line, if you want to put it like this, is indeed to go a4. And you might ask, what is the difference? So let's make some random moves. Bishop e7, bishop e2, castles, knight d7, bishop d2. And it looks as if white is really slow in his queenside play, but all of a sudden he has to make black has to make some choice, because if white is able to get his pawn to a5, for example, if black plays f5, completely ignores it, and white is able to go a5, now it's much harder for black to get in a blockade on the dark squares, and let's say a6, knight a3, now b4, c4, c5 is really just a very nice positional plan. So I mean, black has the chances here, but at least, yeah, there is really some potential for white on the queen side, and black also has the choice to not allow white to go a4, a5 himself, but to go for a6 here and then block the queen side himself with a5. But in this line, white has some additional targets on the queen side. For example, there are a lot of weak squares on b5, b6. The pawn on a5 might be a weakness. If black protects this with b6, who knows, maybe the b6 pawn will be weak. And if we talk about pawn breaks, there's also the option to go c3, b4 at some point to open up the position. And yeah, black has to be very, very careful, and at some point white will be able to open up the queen side. So this is the reason why a4 is much more popular these days than c4. But Maxime had a very concrete idea in mind when he played c4. So let's see what happened. Giri answered with bishop e7, flexible move. And now MVL played the move c5. So he's not waiting for black to go for some kind of a blockade on the dark squares. Instead he says, okay, I will play c5 right away. And this is very, very interesting. First of all, let's not be too greedy here with black, because after d takes c5, white can just play d6, and there are two threats, d takes e7 and knight c7, with a big fork against king and rook. So you cannot take on c5 right away. And the most popular move in this position is just to castle and play knight a6 on the next move. Anish Giri chose knight a6 right away, and there are some differences, because in the game Giri played knight a6 and white was able to get his bishop developed to c4. That would not be that great after castling and bishop c4 right here, and the reason is very concrete, to be honest, but here bishop d7 is just a very annoying move for white to face. I'm just threatening to take on b5, and then I can also take on c5, then I would have sufficient control over the d6 square, and knight takes d6 would already be a horrible blunder, because black has this annoying check queen a5, and it doesn't matter how white react to it. Let's say bishop d2, black can just pick up the c5 pawn, and now d6 is hanging, and if the knight moves, then c4 is hanging, so here white is already losing material. And if white plays c takes d6, which might look like it's winning a piece on the first glance, just because you might think, after bishop takes b5, there's an in-between move with d takes e7, but we see what happens when you open up the position and your king is still in the middle. Black can just recapture on e7, and after bishop takes b5, there's a puzzle rush tactic with queen b4, and black will pick up the bishop on b5 and will have a very, very nice position. So this is the reason why the setup with bishop c4 is not possible in the main line if Giri would have castled instead of knight a6. Maybe you thought it's not too important if white has this option with bishop c4 or not. But yeah, I would still prefer the main line with castling first, because in the game MVL gets some pressure, even though there are some improvements for black along the way. So knight a6, at least white is now forced to take on d6. There's just too much pressure on c5, so c takes d6, bishop takes d6, and now bishop c4, as I said. Black just castles, normal move, castles by white, and now is the first really interesting point in the game. Black now plays knight c7, which is really the only move for black that promises him some equality, because black really wants white to take on d6, because there's really not much black can hope for than this exchange on d6. And let's say white is not forced to take on d6, then the queen will remain on d8, and that means that your rooks are not connected. So this is a little bit annoying, and there are even some concrete reasons. For example, if you go bishop f5, white can go bishop e3, and the knight on b5 is just so annoying. All of a sudden you have to make sure that your a7 pawn is not dropping, so you have to spend some tempi making sure that this pawn is not hanging. So knight c5 might make some sense, but you can see after a move like rook c1, white has some pressure, and yeah, black would just love to have more options in a position like this. So yeah, it makes sense for black to force white to take on d6, so he played knight c7, white grabbed the bishops, knight takes d6, queen takes d6, and this position was already tested in some correspondence games. Most of these games continued with a4, but Maxime played the move queen f3 in this position. But maybe we should talk about the nature of the structure first before we go into the next moves. How do you evaluate such a position? I think the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about the evaluation is that white has the two bishops, so this is one long-term advantage for white. The other big factor in the position is the pawn on d5, which is a passed pawn, and really the question in this position is this pawn rather a weakness or is it a strength? And for the moment there's really not too much activity going on with the pawn on d5. It is nicely blockaded by the queen. In general, the queen is not a great piece to blockade a passed pawn, just because more or less any attack on the queen is reason enough for black that he has to move the queen away from the d6 square. But it's not so easy to make a move that really attacks the queen on d6. There are no squares for your rooks where you can attack the queen, and even the bishop on c1, which is our dark squared bishop. You might think about moves like a4, b3 and bishop a3, but I mean black will also make some moves in between and can react to this. For example, I mean, I just mentioned a4 is a move that is played in correspondence chess, but here black can just go rook d8, and in most of these games black just wins a pawn on d5. And for example, one correspondence games continue with queen e2, and white really didn't find anything better than to exchange this pawn against this pawn, and they made a pretty quick draw in a position like this. So it is a little bit tricky for white to keep the pawn on d5 alive, but at least MVL posed some practical problems, and he played the move queen f3. And now black really, I mean, he still has to think about what he does with the pawn on d5. And if we talk about concrete moves, the big question is, how do you develop this bishop on c8? You cannot really develop it to the king side. All these squares are nicely covered, so it's easy to say b7 is the right square for this bishop. And we have two possibilities to prepare bishop b7. We can go b6 bishop b7, the normal fianchetto setup, or we can go b7, b5 with tempo against the bishop on c4, and then we will be more or less a tempo up. So Giri had to decide which of these two moves he would play, and in general, if black is not able to win the pawn on d5, then the move b7, b6 is just much safer, just because your structure on the queen side is more stable, and especially the square on c5, it might be pretty viable to have this square under control. So Giri, if he wants to play b5 here instead, he really has to make sure that he does indeed win the pawn on d5. Otherwise, this would just be the, positionally speaking, weaker move for black. So let's check this move b5, and the engines really like b5, and it's giving equality in all lines. So bishop b3 makes some sense, bishop b7 makes some sense, and now rook d1 was certainly Maxim's idea. And you can see black can put a lot of pressure on this pawn on d5. He can put either rook to d8, rook fd8, and rook ad8. But really the only way for black to hold this position is the move rook ad8, and even there it's not completely simple. Let's keep in mind that black also has the option where this move would go through d8 and the other move, the other rook would remain on a8. And here there are different possibilities for white to set up some problems. For example, bishop g5 is possible, and that is a move that would refute rook fd8. And the reason is, for example, black has to react. Let's say he goes rook d7, which is more or less the more stable move. If black goes f6, that makes it much harder to win the pawn on d5, just because all of a sudden there would also be a pin along the a2 g8 diagonal. So rook d7 is the better move. And let's say white plays rook d2 here, just with the idea that he can continue with rook ad1. Now black is indeed able to take on d5, because after knight takes d5, it looks pretty risky, but he's just in time to answer rook ad1 with queen g6. And this line would not be possible if this rook would be on a8, because white could just take on d5, and in all these lines the rook on a8 would be hanging in the end. So after queen g5, I would take on b7, and you can take on d2, but well, with the rook on a8, I just take there. There are no back rank mates. My queen on f3 is protecting the rook on d1. So this would be playable for white. And okay, if you take twice on d5, here it's obviously very nicely possible for black, because he can just take on g5. But once again, with the rook on a8 instead, white would just be a piece up. So this is really one critical line, and a line Anish Giri had to find in his calculation if he wanted to make b5 work. But there are also other options, and for example, I really like the line bishop e3 here for white, with ideas like rook c1 and bishop c5, and breaking the blockade of the queen. Here would also be a skewer against queen and rook. And it's also equal, but even here black has to find only moves. So he has to take on d5. And if black wins a tempo against the queen, let's say we move this queen away to move like g3, then black would just be in time to unpin his queen, play something like queen e6, and he would be totally fine. So the critical continuation is rook takes d5, knight takes d5, and rook d1. A pretty common idea to use a pin, and it looks as if white is about to win back the piece on d5, and then you would have two bishops against rook and pawn and would be much better in the resulting position. But black can play the move e4 here. And the queen on f3 really has no great square to go. On every square there are some possibilities for black to have some tactics. So for example, if the queen goes to h5, white has to put pressure on d5. I mean, once again, if you play a move like queen h3 or something, then black just has time to move your queen away to, I don't know, maybe e6 or something, and then white would just be down material. So queen h5 is the critical move, but now there's knight f4, and black is also attacking the queen on h5, so rook takes d6, knight takes h5 is totally fine. And here bishop takes f7 is a nice tactic, very, very sharp, as you can see, with a simple idea that after rook takes f7, and if I take on d6 only then, and black takes on h5, then I can take on d8 the rook, which would then be unprotected. So really fascinating stuff, and we have the typical scenario, a lot of tactics, and in the end it's a draw. So here black shouldn't take the queen, but instead take the rook, and we have a scenario queen against two rooks, and such a position should be roundabout equal. The rooks are not too greatly coordinated. The king is pretty open on g8, b5 is constantly hanging. We have to make a move so we don't get back rank mated. But yeah, this position should be a draw. But as you see, b5, it is pretty risky, and if one line doesn't work, then the whole approach is wrong. And so Giri played b6. He's not the guy who likes to burn bridges. But now white gets some chances for an advantage. White played rook d1, the normal continuation, bishop b7, and now and we had played a very, very tricky move, bishop g5. And the right way for black to play this position is f6, and it's easy to understand why Giri was not too interested in this move, just because the bishop, I mean, it has many squares, h4, e3, d2, all these moves are possible, but it's much harder for black to win the pawn on d5, once again, because all of a sudden there are two pins on the d5 square. But this would really be the right way to play it. The bishop has a lot of possible squares, but no square is really great. So for example, bishop h4 looks normal, but the bishop is really not doing too much, neither here nor on g3. So this is not too dangerous, and I mean, with this pawn on b6, the bishop is also not doing too much on e3. And if you go to d2, then the pawn on d5 is under much more concrete pressure by black. So f6, it looks a little bit funny, but it is indeed the right move. Giri instead played h6 to drive the bishop away, and MVL now played bishop h4. And the main difference is that now white has great control over d8. That makes it very, very hard for black to play rook d8. A move like g5 is really just too ugly to consider. The weakening of the black king is just too devastating. And here white really has some objective advantage. Now black played b5, now arguing that with the bishop on h4, black doesn't have to worry about options like bishop e3, bishop c5, which I just showed. So now this makes some sense, bishop b3, but really the main factor in this position is now are the two bishops once for white and the pawn on d5. And yes, if black is not able to win this pawn, then white will just have a very, very nice long-term advantage. And if we look at black's pieces, I mean, for example, the knight on c7, it's really doing nothing besides attacking the pawn on d5, but if black is not able to take this pawn, this is really not a great square for the knight. So Giri chose to play knight a6, but this is really giving up all hopes of ever winning the pawn on d5, and yeah, white is now just better. MVL played queen e2, attacking the pawn on b5, and Giri really played a nice move here. He sacrificed the pawn to get opposite side colored bishops with knight c5, and MVL took the pawn. Black took on b3, and now there's a tricky question for white. Does he take on b3 with the queen or with the pawn? I think both moves are pretty similar in its evaluation. MVL took with the pawn, which has the advantage that now he might have some pressure along the a file. But on the other hand, this is really not a nice structure for white. So black, I mean, has some nice drawing chances in this resulting endgame. Queen takes b3 would also be possible. Then the structure here would be better, but no pressure on the a file. Yeah, whatever you do it wrong. So a takes b3, rook b8. Black had to protect the bishop on b7. White played f3, a6. Nice move. With this pressure against the pawn on a7, it makes sense to play a6, especially when we can do it with tempo. So queen a5, rook c8, and now rook a3, queen a3 by white. Black cannot keep the blockade on the d6 square. Once again, rook d8 is just not possible with the bishop on h4. But he also doesn't want to take. Certainly then white would repair his structure with b takes a3, and the d5 pawn is able to march forward in such a position. So this would be a good way for white to play for a win. So the big question is, where do you move your queen with black? And in the game, black chose to move queen b6, which makes a lot of sense, because you think, okay, at the very least, it comes with check, and if white plays bishop f2, he loses the control over the d8 square. So pretty clever, you might say, but indeed the better move would be queen g6, and this stops the d5 pawn by tactical means. I mean, first of all, a typical continuation for black would be to go rook c2, and all of a sudden white's king might come under attack. So I think bishop g3 makes a lot of sense in this position. Now there are no threats against g2, and maybe one important tactic we should mention is that if you go d6 in these positions, all of a sudden there's bishop takes f3 with the pinned g2 pawn. Oh, I'm sorry. So bishop g3 really takes away these tactics, but black can still go rook c2. And yeah, black really has to find some only moves if we want to keep the game more or less balanced. For example, here queen b4 makes a lot of sense for white and poses a lot of problems. And really the only way for black to keep the position balanced is to go rook b8 here, pinning yourself, but at least you make sure that d5, d6 is not possible here. So I mean, the bishop really has no great square, so a move like bishop c8, most likely you can just go d6, and all of a sudden this pawn is really rolling down the board. Yeah, and black has to find this move rook b8, and it looks really fishy, but there's no concrete way for white to exploit this unprotected rook. And there's even a trap for black. For example, if you go d6 right now, all of a sudden there's rook takes g2. And after king takes g2, there's bishop takes f3. And now we have the deflection against the white queen. Yeah, so really black is barely holding the position together after queen g6. But I guess it's very understandable why he didn't choose this move. Queen b6 makes also a lot of sense, but now white has some objective advantage. So white played bishop f2, queen b5, d6. Now the pawn is rolling, and that is really the big difference. With the pawn already on d6, there are some ways that black just has very concrete problems to face. He's so close to becoming a queen. Black once again blockades with the queen, and white just has various ideas here to improve his position. Black doesn't have much counterplay here. I mean, with his queen on g6 and the rook on c2, you obviously see the difference. There's an attack against the white king, and white has to be very, very careful. Now there's just no counterplay for black. And I mean, one way for white to play this position is, for example, rook d2 and rook e1, putting some pressure on e5. But yeah, white can really just maneuver without too much ways for him to go wrong. In the game, Giri played queen a4 and played the very interesting idea after bishop c6. Black is not interested in a queen exchange. White went queen h4. And this looks a little bit funny on the first glance, because what is the queen doing here? There's not really an attack against the black king, but there are some ideas connected with queen e7 getting in there. And yeah, this can be very, very annoying for black to face, because let's say you exchange on e7, then all of a sudden the pawn is really just one square away from promotion, and this pawn can easily be stabilized with bishop c5. So very unpleasant for black to allow this. In the game he played rook e8, white played rook c1, a very logical move. Rook c8 and rook c4, and the engines really don't like this move, rook c4. They prefer more or less any move. For example, they like the move h3, just with the idea, if black does the same as in the game, where he went rook e6, rook g6, you can just play queen b4 and put your king on h2, and then there are no threats against the white king. And it's very nice for white to have the option to swing your queen across the fourth rank, left and right, and just try to play on both sides of the board. This is really a nice way for white to make progress. And black has some problems to keep a stable construction. So this would be a better move. And after rook c4, it makes some sense, because maybe you can double on the c file at some point. Who knows, maybe you can play a move like rook g4, attack yourself. But here really Giri found the strong move, rook e6. And now he is once again in time to create some counterplay. Giri played bishop c5, protecting the pawn on d6. And I mean, now there are other moves for black as well, but rook g6 really makes a lot of sense, looking at the f3 pawn. So white played queen f2, protecting this pawn. And now Giri had the right idea. He played rook e8, and really the way for black to open up the position is e5, e4. And he will play this in a moment. So white played rook e1. So for the moment, white has 3 pieces controlling the e4 square, and black only has 2. But yeah, Giri had the right idea, and he played the right move, but his follow-up was not the right one. He played e4. Now that it's possible, white has to take this pawn. And black is in any case able to win this pawn back, and the right way of doing so is just to play f5. And in general, if black has different options how he wins back the pawn on e4, he would love to do this in a way where he is not making any concessions with his pawns. So in the game he played rook g4, hoping that he will just win back the pawn without any weakening of his position. But this gave white some very nice idea. And after f5, the game is really about to just end in a draw. There's nothing wrong. Black will just take on e4 on the next move. You cannot move this pawn on e4 because black has too much pressure against g2. So this is really just close to equal. And after rook g4, white had a very nice option, and that was the move queen c2. And this move is not only protecting the pawn on e4, so you cannot take right away, but it's also looking in the direction along the c file against the bishop on c6. And now black really has some problems, because if black goes f5 right now, white really has a strong move bishop b4. And it's important that we move this bishop to a square where the rook on e1 is protected, because if black takes on e4 with the bishop, then our idea is to go rook c7, in between move. And if the queen moves, then all of a sudden white is the one who has some attack in the position. So bishop takes c2 is a move you consider, and this would be a great move if this bishop would not protect the rook on e1. But here white just takes on d7, and the pawn on d6 is just so strong and quite funny. I mean, you cannot take on b4 because e8 is hanging. If you take on e1, oh, what happened there? So rook takes e1, bishop takes e1, and black really has some big problems stopping this pawn on d6. It's just so strong. Yes, so queen c2, very, very annoying. And f5 is because of this more or less unplayable. And the engines suggest the nice move bishop b5, and this is most certainly better. But it is very interesting because it's not even necessarily a threat, this bishop takes c4, because if we just look at the white pawns, for the moment these pawns are not doing too much. They are pretty weak and are really not supporting this pawn on d6. But let's say white plays a move like, let's say, just h3, and black takes on c4, white can really just recapture on c4 with a pawn, and all of a sudden white really has some flexible pawns in the center on the queen side, however you want to call them. And after rook g5, you just move your bishop back, and this is slightly better for white. I mean, for example, if black takes on d6, we will win back the exchange, but there isn't even a concrete reason why we have to go bishop e3. You can also play b4, just protecting the bishop on c5, and this should have given white very nice winning chances. At least he is much better, and I mean, black has to be very, very careful to not allow these pawns too much forward in the long term. So queen c2 was really a nice move looking in two directions. Obviously you have to back it up with some calculation, but this would have been, I guess, a big chance for MVL to keep the game alive. In the game, white just played h3 and gave the pawn on e4 back, and now white has to take on e4, and he even exchanged twice, and White is still up a pawn, but his extra pawn is one of these b pawns, and against the pawn on a6 there's really no breakthrough for him. Black has a nice blockade on the light squares, and in the game Black even went for a setup with queen c6 and bishop b7, and now there's really no way for Black or for White to ever invade with his queen, because there's always a constant mating threat on g2. And so I guess this is a moment where the players agree to a draw. Yes, it was. So queen c6, last move of the game. Really a missed opportunity for Maxime. He had some chances, definitely. Yeah, but so both players remain on +1. Let's see if either of them can still try to fight for the first place in the remaining rounds. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time. Bye bye.